Hi everyone, it's Russell. Welcome to the Reading Fabricator. I hope you're all doing well. And today I'm going to talk about probably one of my top three favorite reads of the year. An absolutely fantastic novella by the name of Train Dreams by Denis Johnson. Now, this is an author I have not read before, and just like many authors that I've just started reading this year. I've heard about him though. I actually heard about him because of the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, which was not awarded that year. It was one of three finals, along with The Pale King by David Foster Wallace and another book I can't remember of. But it wasn't awarded that year, which was I think the second time in history, coming off of when Gravity's Rainbow was basically, they refused to give it to that book as well. But Train Dreams, I picked it up because people kept comparing it to. They basically referred to it as like a tame Cormac McCarthy, like a less vulgar version of him, and it read that way. It's immaculate. It's taking the mythological expansion of Cormac's Western books like All the Pretty Horses and that sort of thing, mixed in with the declarative sentences of Ernest Hemingway to tell the tale of the life of Robert Grenier. And that's what the novella is. It's like 100 pages of this man's life, an 80-year span from the late 1800s through to the mid-1960s, with all this historical stuff happening in between it. I mean, technically the book is categorized as historical fiction, and I can understand why, because there are so many points throughout this book where I'm like, oh yeah, that happened. So many things going on in different vignettes of this interconnected piece of a truly American life, that I wanted more of it, honestly. It's perfect the way it is, but I also wanted more. I would have been happy if this was expanded into a 500-page book. Instead, we get a 100-page novella that just sprints by. It just flows and it keeps on going. It gives you so much of this guy's life in such a short time span that there is not a dull moment. There is no lull in this book. You find out so much about him. You find out about his very mysterious past. You find out about his marriage and his kid. And you find out about the many jobs he's taken, about the basically the American frontier of that time, and all the various side characters as well. In this part of the community that he basically refused to leave, that he just kept on living in throughout his life. All these side characters they all have their various degradations and ups and downs, but they're so mysterious and so lively that they just linger in your mind. This is a book that will linger in my mind for a very long time. I'm shocked at how much I like this. It is a beautiful piece of work. A beautiful piece of work, which is also a tragedy as well, because honestly, it's the idea of repercussions is a big theme in this book. There's constant repercussions and constant callbacks to various things throughout the book. Everything is in this book for a reason. There's not a single wasted sentence. There are various instances of events happening in the earlier parts of the book that are then called upon later on, or expanded upon, or just they have this emotional payoff that makes it all the more worthwhile. I'm astounded. This really shook me, and I think it deserves a lot more attention. I think it's got something like over 10,000 reads on Goodreads, but I think it deserves a lot more. I think this is a very underread, underappreciated, undervalued book. It needs more discussion. It needs to be talked about more. And being my introduction to Denis Johnson, it makes me want to read more of his work. I keep hearing Jesus' Son is good. A French filmmaker, Claire Denis, did an adaptation of Stars at Noon, which is a novella that I'm trying to track down, but is very hard to find in physical copy. But all in all, I can highly recommend this book. I really can. Now, I'm going to get into the plot of it, but unfortunately, because it's such a slim book and because every event is tied up to events that happen later on in the book, and they all keep calling back on one another, there's no way I can talk about this without getting to spoiler territory. So if this sounds like your thing, then by all means, stop this video, go read it, and then come back and watch the rest of it. Otherwise, yeah, I will continue on starting now. So the book opens partway through his life, where after he works as a railroad labourer, and we catch him at this event where he sees a group of people carrying, I'm just going to have to say it as it's pronounced in the book, but basically an Asian man, or as they refer to as a Chinaman. They're carrying him. He's completely just mentally unstable, just incoherently talking, and they're going to toss him off the edge of the cliff and kill him. And he participates in it. He almost kills this man. The Asian man finally gets away, but this is how we meet Robert Grenier, this railroad labourer who they just built this bridge. The train's going across it. And that is a recurring theme throughout the book. He talks about where he lives, he keeps hearing of these trains keeps on hearing the trains come by, and they inflict on his dreams. A lot of dreams in this book, as evident by the title. It's here that we meet his wife Gladys and their baby daughter Kate. And then from there, it takes you back to the start of his life, of which he comes from mysterious origin. No one knows how he came to be. So this is about a quarter of the way through the book. When a child, Grenier had been sent by himself to Idaho. From precisely where he'd been sent, he didn't know, because his eldest cousin said one thing and his second eldest another, and he himself couldn't remember. His second eldest cousin also claimed not to be his cousin at all, while the first said yes, they were cousins. Their mother, whom Grenier thought of as his own mother as much as theirs, was actually his aunt, the sister of his father. All three of his cousins agreed Grenier had come on a train. How had he lost his original parents? Nobody ever told him. When he disembarked in the town of Fry, Idaho, he was 6 or possibly 7, as it seemed a long time since his last birthday, and he thought he may have missed the date, and couldn't say anyway where it fell. As far as he could ever fix it, he'd been born sometime in 1886, either in Utah or in Canada, and had found his way to his new family on the Great Northern Railroad, the building of which had been completed in 1893. He arrived after several days on the train with his destination pinned to his chest on the back of a store receipt. He'd eaten all his food on the first day of his travels, but various conductors had kept him fed along the way. The whole adventure made him forget things as soon as they happened, and he very soon misplaced this earliest part of his life entirely. His eldest cousin, a girl, said he'd come from northeast Canada and had spoken only French when they first seen him, and they had to whip the French out of him to get room for the English tongue. The other two cousins, both boys, said he was a Mormon from Utah. At so early an age, it never occurred to him to find out from his aunt and uncle who he was. By the time he thought to ask them, many years had passed, and they'd long since died, both of them. Just a very mysterious origin. This boy that just comes off a train and just comes into their lives, and nobody knows anything about him. It's absolutely fascinating. What a great way to show backstory to this enigmatic character, who later on he goes to a church and meets this girl in the choir called Gladys, and instantly falls for her. And he keeps going back to the church even though he's not really into that sort of thing. And eventually we get a sort of a small romance vignette happening, which leads to him marrying her, which leads to him telling her that he bought an acre and with a cottage on it. But then tragedy strikes. This is many years after, and after they've just had a young child. She's barely even a year old. A forest fire hits and completely decimates the entire area that they're in, including their family. He wasn't around to see it. He came back to find out they died. But the descriptions of the forest fire itself are quite vivid and lucid, almost like a dreamlike quality, as evidenced by the amount of talks of dreams that are on in this book. This is him coming back as the fire is happening. The farther north he hiked, the louder came the reports of cracking logs and the hiss of burning, until every charred tree around him gave off smoke. He rounded a bend to hear the roar of the conflagration and see the fire a half-mile ahead like a black and red curtain drop from a night sky. Going ahead a little bit, all his life Robert Grenier would remember vividly the burned valley at sundown, the most dreamlike business he'd ever witnessed waking, the brilliant pastels of the last light overhead, some clouds high and white, catching daylight from beyond the valley, others ribbed in grey and pink, the lowest of them rubbing the peaks and Bussard and Queen Mountains, and beneath the wondrous sky, the black valley, utterly still, the train moving through, making a great noise but unable to wake this dead world. That's probably my favorite paragraph in the whole book. Very Cormac McCarthy-like, I think. A lot of comparisons to be made there. Although, unlike McCarthy, this here is a bit more direct, straightforward, as I said before, declarative sentences in the style of Ernest Hemingway. So, again, if you're into those sort of two authors, I'd highly recommend you give this a read, because it's a novella, 100 pages long, very quick, and you get a hell of a story out of it. A lot of people have actually said that this reminds them of Stoner, the John Williams book, which I haven't read, whereby that is also, the story, the life of a man, but it's Stoner by way of Cormac McCarthy's Suttree, the degradation part of it, with the very unruly characters and side characters in that book who are not quite all there, and there are plenty of those characters in this book as well. But it's also the sentences that detail the surrounding of where he lives. It's very beautifully articulated, I think. It talks of the woods, of the wildlife, And throughout the book, you get mentions where he sees that the wildlife in the world is changing. There's always talks of wolves in the area. And later on in the book, the coyotes come in and push the wolves out of different species of plants growing. He sees the world around him changing, even though he himself refuses to change. And due to the tragedy of his wife and infant child, he sort of recedes back into a life of basically being a hermit. He will take the odd job here and there, but mostly he's just living for himself until the day he dies, and and helping those around him in the community, and more importantly, he's a man of few words. I mean, he does not say a lot in this book. He's more of a listener, and as you, the reader, reading about this character here, it's basically you inside this character's mind, listening to all the side characters talk on about their many weird stuff that goes on, including one part where he gets a couple of horses and a carriage and starts sort of like a moving business where he transports people to and fro. And there's this one guy that he's transporting to a hospital who's been shot, and the guy keeps on telling him that his dog shot him, of which obviously Granier refuses to believe. But then he goes on this long story that's almost mythological in nature about wolf boys and that sort of thing like that. You know, where this wolf wasn't quite human, wasn't quite a wolf. And that is a theme that keeps popping up throughout the book until we get to the second last chapter, which I think is one of the greatest chapters I've read this year. I was absolutely dumbstruck by it. Now, prior to that, he had this vision of one night, and this is a few weeks after he'd gone back up to the cabin and started to build a new house on where it was before. He sleeps outside and he has this vision, this dream. He can't quite perceive it. It's very hallucinatory in nature, the way it's written, of his wife coming to him and telling him that the daughter is not dead. And she describes to him how she went down to the water and placed the daughter in the water to go along the reeds, kind of like the story of Moses. And he refuses to deny it happened. So he believes that his daughter is potentially alive. This comes back into play in the second last chapter of the book, where he walks outside one day and sees a pack of wolves outside his front door, just running around, just laying up dust. But there's this one she-wolf that is hurt and just doesn't continue with the rest of the pack. It just stays there. It's in pain. It's laying on the ground panting. And the way the book talks about mythology and that sort of thing in the area based on the native tribe, I can't remember what their actual tribe name is, but they talk about the idea of wolf boys and wolf girls. He seems to have it in his mind that this is his daughter, who supposedly actually survived the fire, even though there is most likely it isn't her. But it was so realistically described that for a minute there, I actually thought that this was her. Or maybe it is, and she's just sort of grown feral from living with the wolves for a long time. But it talks about him being gentle with her. Actually, you see emotion from him from the first time in years, and he carries this thing into the house, straps the leg where it's supposedly broken, and cares for it. And in the morning, he wakes up to see her go out the window, and I cannot for the life of me think. I cannot decide if this really was his daughter who has basically succumbed to the life of a savage animal, or if it was just a she-wolf and his mind perceives it to be his daughter based on this dream or hallucination that he had years ago when his wife told him that the baby survived. How he's basically been living a life of not coming to terms with what happened. He refuses to believe it happened. And if that's true, then that makes this book all the more sadder. I've seen a lot of people talk about this book as being a tragedy, seeing someone who lost everything. They built up a life, they had a family and everything, and then they lost it all, and they lost their love of life and just decided just to live day and day at a time until eventually they die. But it's not all doom and gloom. We get a lot of adventure side stories, like when he goes to Canada and flies in a plane for the first time, and the father and the son who are basically giving away plane rides for I think $4 or something like that. And there's a funny story where the pilot's like turning around and the plane's going into a bit of a nosedive, and Robert Graney is sort of just sitting there going, what the hell's happening? There's another one where he goes and sees the world's fattest man. He encounters Elvis, or rather he hears that Elvis came through the town on a train and he wasn't there to see it, but he overheard people talking about how Elvis was there. So it's just these little Americana type things that are sprinkled throughout the book that just sort of give you that feel of historical fiction. it really grounds it a little bit, um, corroborating with the mythology of all that wolf stuff as well. I mean, it gets to a point there where he starts howling when he hears the wolves howl, and he finds that it brings him comfort, so he just keeps on doing it every day when he hears them. He gets a pet dog who keeps coming back and going forth. And yeah, it's just little things like that. It's just little instances and events, all to do with side characters that infiltrate their way into his life, where you see just how tragic, beautiful, but also really brilliant this book is. There's so much to discuss for such a small piece of work. It's epic in miniature form. I would love to see this made into a movie. Honestly, I think it'd be a cracking book way to watch something. I think it'd be a great thing to watch. It'd be really, really mesmerizing. It feels unique. It feels authentic. Authentic is probably the right word to describe it. There's no $1,000 words here. There's nothing here. There's no sentences where you're like, oh, well, this is just show offy. He just tells you how it is. That's all it is. He just tells you how it is. And because every sentence is joined and flows into one another, it just keeps on going in the sort of beautiful harmony and symphony of beautiful storytelling. This is wonderful storytelling, and I'm all the more happier for it. I'm glad I found this book. It's truly, truly a marvelous read. Here's a description of the latter part of his life. Even into his last years, when his arthritis and rheumatism sometimes made simple daily chores nearly impossible, and 2 weeks of winter in the cabin would have killed him, Granier still spent every summer and fall in his remote home. By now it no longer disturbed him to understand that the valley wouldn't slowly eventually resume its condition from before the Great Fire. Though the signs of destruction were fading, it was a very different place now, with different plants and therefore with different animals. The gorgeous spruce had gone. Now came almost exclusively jack pine, which tended to grow up scraggly and mean. He'd been hearing the wolves less and less often. From farther and farther away, the coyotes grew numerous, the rabbits increasingly scarce. From long stretches of the Moye River through the burn, the trout had gone. Maybe one or two people wondered what drew him back to this hard-to-reach spot, but Granier never cared to tell. The truth was he'd vowed to stay, and he'd been shocked into making this vow by something that happened about 10 years after the region had burned. And then eventually it just leads to his death, whereby even though the community knew and loved him, no one went to check on him, and he went 2 full seasons just in his cabin rotting as a dying corpse before 2 hikers found him, got the doctor the next day, and then they buried him, and there he lays in an unmarked grave outside his house. The life of Robert Granier, a unique individual who you wouldn't think has lived a life but has. It makes you think of various people you probably know in your personal life where you come to think that maybe they've just led a reclusive life, or they haven't really lived much, until you eventually start talking to them and realize that there is something there. They have a story to tell. I think this is what this book is talking about, is that how every person has a story to tell, no matter how tragic they may appear. I agree with the comments that have been made where it talks about tragedy and repercussions. Repercussions is a big theme here, but I'm in awe of this book. There's nothing fancy about the writing, again, as I said, but it hooks you. It hooks you hard, and you want to read about the life of this man. And I couldn't ask for anything more. This was wonderful. I'm glad I read it. So hopefully you liked it too. Yeah. Thanks very much. See you on the next one. Bye.